The Memu gloves are a way of making music with gestures, hand movements that can be translated to sounds. So, for example, I can make hand movements that might relate to a real instrument. For instance, I could hit a drum. I could make that kind of motion. I could play some drums. I could strum a guitar. I could do very abstract things like grab a sound and sort of manipulate it like this. They just turn all this movement through bend sensors and gyroscopes and all this very sciencey stuff, turning your hand movements, what are natural flowing movements, into sounds. And then with a bit of skill and a bit of practice, you can turn that into music, and you can play songs and do all the things that you would expect to be able to do with a musical instrument. One of the big differences is that you can do a lot more with these than traditional electronic music making devices. For example, you see DJs all the time manipulating a control to make a kind of a filter sound, or that familiar sort of bass drop in a club or whatever. But you do that with one hand and then you do something else with the other, and you're kind of stuck. We've all only got two hands. The gloves work in a 3D space, so you can, for example, have the X, Y and Z axis to control, say, three things with one flowing movement. And that's with just one hand, so you can add something else to the other hand. So you can grab a lot of stuff seemingly out of thin air. And as well as that, they are, I believe, a breakthrough in accessible music technology, because they can be mapped in a way that they learn your movements as a user. So, for example, these gloves are trained to me and to deal with the issues I have with my hands, and they work for me, and somebody else would have a very different result from them unless they train them to themselves. So in a way, it can be molded to the user's access needs in a way that a traditional instrument can't be. The gloves are so important to me now, because there's two stages to learning to play these instruments, really. There is using them to overcome access needs and learning how to do things. For example, there were songs that I removed from my set because I found playing them on a real instrument too complicated. Now that kind of note information can be put into more easily accessible movements with the gloves. But then beyond that, once you've leveled the playing field in terms of access, it becomes about how far I can push them as a musical instrument. One of the things that you can do with the gloves that has never been possible before is to take a whole arrangement of music, whether it's a string section and some drums and, a guitar part or whatever, and you can cram loads of information into one movement. So the result there is that I can bring the kind of big full band sound that my recordings have onto the stage and in a solo show, where before I would perform with one instrument, be it a piano or a guitar. Now, the line between how I sound on a record and how I sound on stage is completely blurred by the gloves and what they allow me to do. Being a disabled artist is really tricky. Everyone's experience will be different, but for me, because I'm mobility impaired, that has a big impact on where I can go and how I can get around. I think part of the problem was, and I bet this is quite common, I didn't make enough of the kind of problems I was having. I sort of put up with situations that were really inaccessible to me because I just sort of felt like I didn't want to make a fuss. Perhaps, like I remember performing at an open air festival, and the only route onto the stage was to climb up a bit of scaffolding, which was no problem for anyone else on the bill, but of course for me that was really difficult, and then it was quite embarrassing to have to ask for help and all that kind of stuff. But it's just, access isn't sort of the key thing, really. Even if access is improving for audience members, I feel that as performers, it just doesn't feel like it's progressing at the same rate. You might be at a venue that, for example, has a ramp outside and is accessible to wheelchair users in the public areas, but perhaps backstage you've got some steps or something to a dressing room or a toilet or whatever. And it's really, really difficult, actually. There was a point when I felt like I probably felt a bit defeated by it and considered not performing anymore because it just felt quite difficult. but yeah, in terms of like looking ahead and sort of researching stuff, nowadays I just try to be a bit more ruthless and just think, you know what, I'm not going to worry about if I'm causing some trouble by asking some questions about access and stuff. I mean, I've even very recently I performed at a very big event in London, and parking there, the disabled access was really not very good in terms of the fact that from where I was allowed to park my car, which was designated as blue badge parking, the walk to the stage was a really long way. The problem there, of course, is that I believe there's a simplified idea of disability that disabled means that you're a wheelchair user. So for a wheelchair user, that, for example, was not inaccessible. But for someone who is mobility impaired and on their feet, it's incredibly difficult. And I don't feel that, especially in live music, I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of understanding all the different kinds of access needs out there, which is why I'm obviously incredibly grateful to be working with Attitude as Everything, because it's just so important to get this message across that disability is very complex. Live music is a difficult beast to kind of like, you know, rein in and sort of say, well, what works for enough people? And you can understand that venues have a hard time with this stuff. Perhaps they're in old buildings where it's difficult to make changes and whatever, but it still needs to progress. And thankfully, I feel that, you know, especially doing with this tour, we are raising some interesting questions about access. And every venue we've spoken to so far has been really, really helpful. And I'm quite optimistic about going on the road this time round, as it happens. There's so many great artists that I love to see perform. In the context of what I'm doing, and we're talking about access, I couldn't help but think of probably my favourite singer-songwriter being Ryan Adams, who is just absolutely spellbinding live. I saw him earlier last year, and it was just incredible. But he himself has his own access issues. He has Meniere's disease, which affects his balance and this kind of thing. And there was some effort to make the gig accessible to him. Anyone who was near the front of the stage was given a little letter explaining his condition, and don't flash photography could set it off and that kind of thing. The volume was noticeably quieter than a lot of gigs I've been to, which was interesting. What really I found incredibly frustrating was that people were still taking flash photos, and he was clearly having a hard time with it. And that's quite worrying, actually, that people just, even with an artist of his status, and even with a kind of a nudge of like, he has got an issue here that we need to respect, people were kind of more interested in Instagramming it and stuff, and, causing him some discomfort, which was a bit of a shame to see. But he is just incredible to me, a huge influence on my work, which might sound a bit strange given how electronic my music is at the moment, but certainly I've learned a lot from him, and yeah, he's just incredible to see live. Well, the first thing that's really exciting for me is to be able to bring the kind of full sound of my records to the live show for the first time ever. All the little intricacies and all the layers and details of my records will be performed with the gloves. So the gloves are controlling all the sounds. It's not just kind of a conveyor belt of backing track stuff. I'm playing it, and I'm playing a lot of things at once with the gloves. I also feel that the visual side of how the gloves work really surprises people. I did a performance in a very public space at the South Bank Centre not too long ago, and the reaction when you show somebody something, I would like put down some drums and then kind of grab them and like turn them down or affect them or chop them up and do all these different things with the gloves. People haven't seen that stuff done with gestures. We're only just kind of like catching up with the idea of wearable technology. So to take something like this and turn sound into kind of a malleable thing that we can kind of grab hold of and manipulate, it's always got really strong reactions when I've ever performed with them in public. So I've certainly got a few tricks up my sleeve in terms of what I've not done in public before for this show, which obviously I'm saving for this. And so, yeah, I'm hoping I can, do something that will kind of get a few sort of double takes with some of the glove trickery. That's an interesting question. To flip it on its head a little bit, a question, I suppose, whatever the opposite of this is, a question that I get asked a lot, which kind of grates a little bit, is people assume that perhaps, like, I've got these gloves on, so if I was to hand them over to them and they put them on, that as if by magic, beautiful music is just going to come out as soon as they wave their hands around. And of course, it's not that. It's a very skilled, very complicated thing that you're doing here. This is a real instrument. It's not just kind of an on-off button. It can be used in ways that are simple and accessible, but there's a degree of virtuosity in terms of how people like myself and Imogen Heap are pushing it and trying to make it into something really new. So I suppose the problem is, I guess people don't ask about that so much. So the answer would be, yeah, there is a great degree of musicianship to it, and it's not sort of a magic trick of like, put the gloves on and wave your hands around. That would be nice in some ways because it'd be really easy, but it would get very boring very quickly for musicians like myself who do like to kind of push the boundaries and see how far you can take this stuff. So yeah, I'd like more people to ask me about that, please.